Hi everyone, this is Michelle from East Ave Art. Join me in painting this cute little pumpkin. Okay, so we're going to start with some tracing paper. One tip I have is to draw on paper that's not your watercolor paper that you're going to paint on. So if you're like me and you erase a lot, you don't want to sketch on watercolor paper because the erasing will damage the quality of the paper and ultimately how the paint lays on the paper. Even if you're using a less abrasive eraser, like you can see I have a rubber eraser that you don't really rub too much, it still kind of damages the paper. So you want to keep the integrity of the paper. And so I like to draw on tracing paper because I transfer the sketch onto my watercolor paper, and the sheerness of the tracing paper makes it easier for me to transfer my sketch. So to draw a pumpkin, you're going to draw an oval. If you can draw an oval, you can draw a pumpkin. And I start with an oval in the center, and then I kind of draw ovals on each side of it. And you'll see that I'm gonna sketch a few pumpkins until I see one I'm happy with. So I have kind of a pumpkin that has, 3 parts to it. And I'm gonna kind of look at this one and think, this isn't quite as interesting to look at as a more complex pumpkin. So I'm gonna start another pumpkin sketch in the same way with some ovals in the center, but I'm going to be adding more sections of the pumpkin to give it a little bit more visual interest. And you'll see I kind of darken up my pencil sketch just to get a little bit more of a sense of what it's going to look like on the paper. All right, so now that I've got a shape that I like in pencil for this pumpkin, I'm gonna trace over it with pen and just sort of finalize my sketch so that I can easily transfer this over to my watercolor paper. Okay, so here you're gonna see the benefit kind of going over it with the pen because I can see through much easier on the other side. And you guys remember doing this in elementary school where you color in the other side with your pencil, and I can flip it over and transfer it directly to my watercolor paper. And so you can see where I've sort of saved myself the benefit of, not having damaged my watercolor paper too much. And here you'll see me go ahead and transfer my sketch onto the watercolor paper. Of course, here I'll kind of darken up some of those lines so that I can see them as I'm painting. So I forgot to mention that I am painting on Arches watercolor paper. I use a 140-pound cold press because I like the toothy texture of that watercolor paper. And I'm also using Mung Yuo 48 pan watercolor set. I prefer working on the pans. And so you'll see I use a spray bottle to activate the paints in my watercolor set. And I just have 2 cups of clean water, and I'll go from there. So I'm starting this painting of a pumpkin with a dusky blue color. You can see me putting that on my palette. So you might be wondering why I didn't just start with orange on my palette. That's like the most obvious color you would think of. Well, an object like a pumpkin is never just one solid color. So if you really want to take your paintings to another level, you're going to have, variations, and you're going to be thinking about how many different colors you actually see when you're looking at an object. So a few things to think about. An object always has a highlight, where the light is hitting it. There's also shadows where the light isn't hitting it. And then there's kind of some other color variations that you can, think to include as well. But those two things are kind of really the first things you want to start thinking about. And so the reason why I'm using blue is that is going to be a great color to represent the shadows. So I'm going to start painting blue in the areas where I see shadows on the pumpkin. So in the crevices of the pumpkin and towards its base, where the light really isn't hitting it. And I chose blue because blue is a complementary color to orange. It sits opposite to orange on the color wheel, so it really serves as a great shadow color for orange to lay underneath it. And so you'll see I'm gonna keep working on adding that blue into areas where I see shadows. Okay, so I've mixed up an orangey yellow, so a really light orange, to represent the lightest color that I see on the pumpkin. And as I'm putting this yellowy orange down on my paper, you can see I'm going right over the areas where I've marked out the shadows. And you'll also see me leaving some negative space. And what I mean by negative space is like places where I'm not painting. So I'm just using the color of the paper, which is this white background, to represent the highlight. So where the sun or the light source would be hitting the pumpkin, it's going to be white because it's causing that reflection. And you can see that I've elected to do that sort of towards the top, and I've even kind of given a little bit of a angle to it that follows the angle, like kind of the roundness of the pumpkin. As I'm laying down this orangey yellow, you can see where at certain points I'm reactivating the blue paint a little bit just to kind of get a softer blend of the colors and less harsh lines. And that's one of the advantages that you can have with working with watercolor papers, that you can use the water to reactivate paint that's already dried. So if you're familiar with working with acrylics, that's not really so much of an option. Once acrylic dries, it's kind of just on there. But with watercolor, you can reactivate the paint with more water, more even paint on your along with that water, if you want to try to get a softer blend. And sometimes even to get that softer blend, I'm actually scrubbing a little bit. And then you'll see me a few times even put in a little bit more blue underneath the, along with the orange, to kind of just deepen that shadow color where I see it at its darkest. So now I'm going in with an orange that has a little bit of a reddish brown that I've mixed in, really to get the main color of the pumpkin, that orange that you typically associate with pumpkins. And again, I'm putting this glaze directly over the blue paint as well. And you can see how the blue almost kind of has got like a brownish shadow to it, which was exactly what I wanted for this effect. And you can see that my pumpkin is basically dry. So when I'm adding this orangish reddish mix, I'm able to get some nice effect by doing a little bit of dry brushing, sort of more at the base and areas around the stem of the pumpkin, to really bring that color up to look a little bit more realistic. So you can see I continue to make adjustments. I'm messing around with, at some points, making the shadows a little bit darker. And you'll notice too that I'm leaving the left side of the pumpkin alone. That still has more of this sort of yellowy orange mix that I made at the very beginning, because in my mind, that is where the light is hitting that pumpkin. So I'm going to leave that to be sort of the lightest part of the pumpkin. So here I'm gonna mix up some of the colors for the stem, And for the stem, I'm going to mix up a bit of brown and olive green. I feel like that combination gives me a really realistic color when I'm working with plant material. And again, I'm going to follow the same process as I did when I painted the pumpkin itself. I'm going to leave some negative space to reflect the reflection from the light that's hitting the pumpkin. And you'll also notice as I keep painting, I'm going to let it get a little bit darker at the base where the stem meets the pumpkin. I'm going to get a thicker consistency of brown to really deepen that base of the stem. So that would be the area where the light isn't really quite reaching the pumpkin, where the stem is meeting the pumpkin itself. Okay, so lastly, I'm going to create a shadow under my pumpkin, and I'm going to go back to the well with that same color blue, which is what I started with to show the shadows on the pumpkin in the first place. And adding this shadow at the base of the pumpkin, it gives it the appearance of being sort of 3D. You can see it's anchored on the page, and it throws a real nice kind of sense of completion to the painting. Okay, so there you go, a realistic pumpkin for Halloween. Thanks for joining.